Hello, and thank you for coming to the 10th Lake County Film Festival. This is the Q&A session for Through the Cracks, and I'm very excited to have director Ben Scholle here with us to talk about the film. How's it going, Ben?
It's going great, thank you.
It's always the first question, but it's always funny because I've already asked that question like 10 minutes ago when they come in. So let me ask you, how did Jimmy Johnson's story come to you?
So I was working with the Missouri Public Defenders on a different case. They contacted me in the summer of, I don't even know, like 2011 maybe, about a different defendant who had actually requested a documentary. So he saw, I think, a couple of other cases. He was on death row. This guy was kind of coming down to his final appeals. He'd seen some other cases that were helped by some documentary films and some other press coverage. And he said, hey, maybe that's something that we could do for me, for my story. So I met with them. Like they contacted a few different filmmakers. I took the bait, and met with them, talked about this guy. And I was open to it. It was a much different kind of a case. It was a guy who had been, I believe, convicted of killing witnesses against him in a different first-degree murder case. So he'd been accused of murdering somebody, and then he had potentially he'd been convicted of killing the witnesses in that case. Had been tried, convicted, and then I believe appealed, had a new trial, and was convicted again. And he was interested in a film, and I thought, well, this would be. I don't know exactly what the issue is here. I think there's enough documentaries out there about, like trying to undo an injustice and free an innocent person, who's been wrongfully convicted and all those things. Like, I thought, well, maybe this is one where, we can just sort of examine the death penalty and see what that means in a case where, it sounds really awful on the surface. And so I met with the public defenders and went through some of the files. And eventually, I think I said, I'm interested in doing this film, but I want you to know up front that if I do it, I'm not going to necessarily, I'm not going to ignore anything that I come across. So in other words, I want to tell this story from all sides, because I feel like otherwise it's just going to come across as sort of slanted and, like a propaganda piece for the guy who's your defendant. And so I said that, and they said, well, that makes a lot of sense. And they went and met with him, and he said, oh, you know what? Actually, maybe not, because I think it sounded like he was worried that other stuff might come up in the process of making the documentary that might get him in even more trouble than he was already in, being on death row. So that was scrapped, and so we were talking about it, and they said, though, like if you're interested in doing a documentary, we have this other case about this guy named Johnny Johnson who came through our office. In his original trial, and now he's one of our clients in post-conviction work. And they said, if there's any case that's bothered us for a really long time, it's this one. This case haunts us. It's just so tragic. It just bothers everybody who's been touched by it, and we think it might be something that's worthy of a film. And so I met Johnny, and I went through all the case files, and decided, same thing. I think it would be an interesting film to make. There was nobody who was claiming that Johnny didn't kill Casey. There was nobody I talked to at any point who disputed that. But I thought that, in that sense, it's sort of a unique death penalty film in that it allows us to just focus on, I think, the individuals and their stories, and sort of putting a human face on what a lot of death penalty cases are.
Do you have a history with the true crime genre, either as a fan or I don't know much about your film backstory?
Yeah. Not so much, really. It's interesting because I didn't even think of this really. I think the label true crime wasn't on my radar when I started working on it. I will say, like, probably one of the films that pulled me into documentary making more than any other was The Thin Blue Line. So in that sense, if that's kind of like your prototypical true crime film, which maybe it is, then yeah, that's something I'm definitely interested in. But that said, I feel like it's kind of exploded. And I think what I found is that, this film, I probably, if I'd been really fixated on distribution from the very beginning, and if I'd been really savvy in that sense, I might have made it differently had I known that there'd be like a market for true crime style films. Do you know what I mean? But I also feel like, it's almost like those films tend to be a little bit sensationalized. You know what I mean? And I feel like I kind of tried as much as I could to, not necessarily gloss over like the details, but also I didn't want to overstate things. You know what I mean? I feel like the film I ended up with was much more, I don't know if ambiguous is the word, but it was definitely much more meditative than a lot of those films would be. I think if I'd made it with that label in mind, it would have been a different film.
What year did you start making it?
It's actually so long ago now that I don't remember. I think I said 2011 earlier. It might have been 2012. It is somewhere in the early part of that decade.
Sure.
Yeah, so it was a while ago.
Well, certainly that was before the current true crime boom.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you mention Thin Blue Line, I don't even know if that would be considered the grandpa of the genre, or actually just like Adam, like what was true crime film, before Thin Blue Line.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have this huge crop of really great. I mean, I honestly love them all. Almost everyone I've seen has something really amazing. That's everything on. I had someone earlier today. I did a Q&A for the John Wayne Gacy Defending a Murderer documentary that we're showing, which is not really that much about John Wayne Gacy. It's about his defense attorney.
Mm-hmm.
And oh boy, I just lost a thought here. So he was saying, not counting the kind of exploitative cable shows. If you have commercial breaks worked in, probably like you don't count. But everything else that's HBO, Showtime, Netflix is putting out, I love. And now this year I've got 3 films I'm showing, as well as one I programmed at Nashville, that are very different. And I don't know if the true crime, label fits on everything. 3 of them, which are about people who clearly committed the crimes, are not mysteries, which seems to be the real true calling card for. It is still a true story about a crime, but the calling card that really attracts people, I think, is the mystery, and they don't have mysteries. And I asked him if he thought, and I don't know if this counts as a big trend, just because 2 independent film festivals that are covering independent movies are showing them. I don't know if that counts as a trend, but I'm wondering if the genre post this boom is starting to mature and look for other stories, or if an audience is looking for other stories that mean other things besides did they do it, or something like that.
Yeah, well, I think that's just the nature of a genre, right? Is that it just keeps on evolving as time goes on, and people are looking for more, and they're looking for more depth. And obviously, like, things sort of like shoot off in different directions. But I would even say, I guess any film is a mystery, right? Like, I knew that this was not a whodunit that I was putting together, but I also, approached it thinking, well, I know I'm curious about some things, right? I know that having heard the basic facts of this, I've got questions in my mind. And I'm going to seek answers to those questions, and I'm going to do my best to take the audience on that same journey with me, right? And then also probably, withhold some information and kind of keep them, curious, hopefully, until the end, so that they can have, I guess, some of the same kind of, I don't know if it's like satisfaction necessarily in this film, because I don't find it to be a satisfying film, but some of the sort of like closure, or some of the sort of like resolution that I experienced when I was working on it too.
So what do you think, I don't know. I mean, I'm always talking about how good art is advocacy. So what do you think you're advocating for, and how has this film helped you achieve that?
Oh, it's a really good question. So I think what I was advocating for when I started is different than what I landed on. So I think initially I came into this as somebody who is very opposed to the death penalty, and I finished it as somebody who is still very opposed to the death penalty, but I think I might have come into it wanting it to be a real anti-death penalty film. And I think what got me to this was, like, early on when I was just starting to work with it, I met with a guy who I co-produced another film for probably 5 years prior, or another film with 5 years prior. And he and I were just talking about it. And he said, oh man, he said, the death penalty is a tough topic for me. He says, I know innocent people have been convicted and killed. I know that it's used disproportionately against minorities. He said, but you know, I also feel like there are just some people who are so sick that they need to die. And I thought, damn, that's not how, like, that was not what I was expecting to hear. You know, it kind of like floored me a little bit, but it made me think that is not an insignificant subset of people, right? That who are opposed to the death penalty, but who have exceptions to that, who are willing to make exceptions for things that they think are really, really awful. But then I also realized that, like, you know, people are making those judgments based on what they're hearing in the news, or based just on like the facts of the crimes in some cases. So I think what that sort of turned the film into, just thinking about it that way, it made me think, all right, well, let's test this, right? Let's say, all right, if you are opposed to the death penalty, let's see, but maybe you would make exceptions for certain things. Let's test that. Let's say, okay, here's a case that by all accounts is one of the more horrific things that came through this region in a couple of decades. So if you explore this in depth, how do you feel about the death penalty after that? Can you hold up your feelings about it one way or the other, whether you're opposed to it or in favor of it? And so I think that's what I wanted to do, was just explore this one case deeply, and also hear as much as I could from people who are on both sides of it, to let the audience, I guess, examine their feelings. You know, that's really what I think I ended up wanting. The discussions that we've had about it have been with people who were opposed to the death penalty, people who are for the death penalty, you know, and I don't think it's like, I don't think I've hidden the fact that I'm coming from, you know, from a point of view, like I have my point of view, and that is that I do not believe in the death penalty, but also that I believe that we have, you know, a problem in this country with mental illness in the criminal justice system. You know, I think that's something that the film shines a light on, and definitely something I think is important. But I think it's really mostly about having conversations. You know, I think that's what I want, is for people to think clearly and have dialogues with people who might be on the other side of the issue. But I'll follow that up with one thing, because you asked me, it's a really long answer, I apologize. So you asked me for, like, is there anything I'm advocating for? And I will say this, that, like, what I love about the films like this is that when you get people together who are on two sides of an issue, sometimes what you find is that there's actually a third thing that they all agree on. You know, so in this case, prosecutors are generally pro-death penalty. Public defenders are generally against it. You know, obviously the family of the victims tend to be for the death penalty. Family of the perpetrators tend to be against. You know, you had things kind of lining up as you would expect. But every single person I talked to on every side of this issue said, it is clear that we don't have the services that we used to have, or the services that we need for the mentally ill. And right now we need better public resources for mental health. And I think that ultimately, like, if you can do that, if you can find at the end of a film that, you know, even though people aren't going to agree on some things, if there is a consensus around anything, like, that's an important takeaway. And so I tried to kind of take the film to that point at the end where we can at least see that there's, you know, one thing we can all agree on.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the person you talked to specifically said that there's some people that are so sick. Mm-hmm. And that's nomenclature that a lot of people won't use, because why would you kill somebody because they're sick? You know, mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly what they said, but that would be an argument for the other side, you know?
Yeah, no, and that is what he said. And it, yeah, that's exactly how I felt about it too. I thought, well, and that was something I guess I struggled with maybe more than anybody else too. Like, I went into this thinking, you know, like, well, if, you know, what does it take to do something like this, right? And like, I was trying to sort of like figure out philosophically, you know, what's the culpability, right? And like, what, you know, where is this? Is there a line, you know, where you're responsible for your actions and where you're not? And really, what I found was that, you know, like the the prosecutors, who no doubt have thought about this, basically just said, I don't know, not my problem. Somebody got killed. My job is to get a conviction, you know? And I think even Casey's aunt, Della, in what she was saying, she said, well, of course he's sick. And nobody could do this and not have some sort of mental illness that led to it. But I think she, you know, was willing to put that aside and say, you know, there's still something that she felt needed to be punished. And so, yeah, that's to me, that's still, it's one of those things that just bothers you. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things, you see something like this happen and it just doesn't sit right, you know, to see that somebody is mentally ill or any case like this, you know, to see that somebody has issues that obviously led to this. But you know, people much more well-read on this issue than me have struggled with this and debated about this kind of thing for a long time.
I mean, I guess this is in a way a socio-political issue. And I'm always really intrigued by where people draw lines on social-political issues. You know, the death penalty, or the one that always gets me, is that we pay for kids as a society to get schooling from kindergarten to 12th grade, and that's capitalism. But if we extend it to pre-K and extend it to 16th grade, now we're communist, right? Do you have a line on the death penalty? It always struck me as strange how it was used state by state, and how we would have, you know, people that were proven innocent in some states that were on death row, but yet Jeffrey Dahmer, who's caught with human bodies in his freezer, does not get the death penalty.
Right.
Do you have a line where you think, oh, well, you know, this is something that the death penalty would be good for?
I mean, personally, my line is that the death penalty is good for nothing. You know, but I think that it is interesting to see how different states, and obviously a lot of this comes down to judicial precedent, you know, through either the U.S. Supreme Court or state Supreme Courts. But I think, yeah, there's, you know, there are IQ thresholds. You know, Johnny Johnson is somebody whose IQ was just above that threshold. So he was eligible for execution for that reason. And, you know, it's also, you know, been said that, like, mental, you know, they don't want to execute people who are mentally ill, but defining that, right? Or defining, even more importantly, was mental illness a factor in the crime? Was that the reason why he was, why he did what he did? And I think that's something that, you know, I actually looked at another case, that Bob McCullough, the prosecutor in St. Louis County, had prosecuted. So that originally I was kind of exploring two cases in parallel, and I settled on Johnny's as the one that I'd make the film about. But interestingly, both of those cases were ones where somebody was diagnosed as schizophrenic, but they were also using drugs at the time of the crime. And so McCullough argued in both of those cases that it was drug use more than the mental illness that made the defendant responsible. So I think that's another thing that can be used to cloud the issue, right? And I think that's, you know, that's what you see, is that it's so like, you know, sure, you can have an IQ threshold, but with mental illness, it's so difficult to have anything that's like tangible and defined. And I think that's what prosecutors and defenders try to use to, you know, to make their case. But the problem is that, you know, I think the prosecution has an advantage in that sense, you know, where I think that they are able to use the system and appeal to the jury in a way where if it can't be proven that this person is mentally ill, then people are willing to assume that they're responsible for their actions.
It's interesting that I feel like there's been a large backlash of the IQ test in showing how smart someone is, but then no one really ever talks about the other end of that. It's not something that comes up.
Yeah.
So have you been able to use the film for advocacy? Do you have plans to, you know, use the film in that way besides just a general release?
Yeah. So it was picked up by Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty as something that they had a statewide screening for, a virtual screening, kind of like this. A few months ago, I want to say August maybe. and I'm definitely open to other groups like that. I've talked to them a little bit about trying to expand that. I also really would like to have this something that could be used in educational settings. I feel like, so I teach at a college, and I know, that it's always nice to have resources that can kind of spark a certain kind of discussion. And I feel like this film might fill a void that's there for discussions in criminal justice classes and in psychology classes, specifically about mental health and criminal justice. And I think it approaches, it does an in-depth case study in a way that might be useful for students and faculty to talk.
Cool. Can you talk about the filmmaking process? What were kind of any obstacles that you had along the way?
For this film, I think my biggest obstacle was my day job. I feel like it was a matter of just finding the time. I shot a lot of interviews in like 2013, 2014, had a lot of stuff ready to go relatively early on, went through a lot of files, captured a lot of archives. So I really had most of the raw material. I probably had, I'll say like 80 to 90% of this recorded by 2014. But honestly, it was transcribing and outlining and editing and really sort of like putting together the skeleton of it, which is my favorite part. It's what I love to do, but it was also the most time consuming part of the process. So yeah, I don't know. I think on one hand, it would have been nice to be able to just like devote all of my time to it. At the same time, sometimes it's sort of nice to be able to let something stew a little bit. You know what I mean? To like just kind of have it there in the background and think about it and let things evolve a little bit, and talk to more people.
I'm trying to teach my son the same thing when it comes to writing, letting things percolate.
Yeah.
Thinking about them, get started on this project early, so it'll come up and you'll think about it and it'll be that much better when you're done.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Is there, well, actually the reason I asked about the advocacy is because I've talked to, many filmmakers over the years who've been able to get like congressional screenings or just stuff in front of legislatures.
Mm-hmm.
So this organization is potentially doing that with Missouri legislatures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're actually working on legislation right now that would create a little bit more defined exemption to the death penalty for people who are mentally ill. So that's something that hopefully this film could help with. I know that's something that's kind of in their legislative agenda. It was last year, ended up not coming up, and it may not come up this year either, but it's something they're plugging away at.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are dealing with a nationwide issue, but it'll be at least nice to at least if you can change things locally.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to say about this, but I'd like to chat a little bit about why we place mental health so low on the priority list. Although we could also talk about why we place health at all so low on the priority list of this nation. Any thoughts on that, or mental health in particular?
Well, I think what I guess I can say is that in cases like Johnny's, he didn't have a lot of access. I think that was part of the issue. The only way that he became involved in getting mental health care, well, at least like really thoroughly, was because he was in the criminal justice system to begin with. So he'd been arrested for, I think it was a robbery or burglary, sometime prior to all this happening. And so it was really, through his probation that he was required to have a social worker and required to get mental health treatment and required to be medicated. So I think, to me, it's because the people who suffer from this are marginalized already for so many reasons. And in a lot of cases, it's because they're already the folks who are poor or homeless, or else sometimes they become that way, or because obviously there's kind of a lot, a system of stigma, I guess, in different levels that we associate with mental illness, which is becoming less and less the case. But yeah, I think it's, the people who have the least ability to voice their need are the ones who are being overlooked.
So what's next for the film?
So right now I am working on educational, sort of packaging it for an educational distribution push. And then, you know, I'd like to make it available to other nonprofits for screenings. You know, I this is not the kind of film, you know, again, like if I'd been more commercially minded, I might have made a different film, but it's not that kind of film necessarily. And I'm okay with that. You know, I'm really happy just to be able to show it, you know, publicly. A few places have conversations like these, you know, hopefully spark conversations over dinner by people who just watched it. That's what I'd like for it to do. So I just would like to, you know, get it out there largely in educational settings. But, you know, again, like, you know, I'm hoping to be approached by more, you know, nonprofits and community groups that are, you know, looking for something to show for, you know, meetings, if we ever get to have meetings again.
Are you?
Yeah.
Every once in a while, there's a point in these conversations where it's like, oh yes.
Well, but I gotta tell you, like the virtual screening that we did in August was great. I mean, there were probably, I don't know, 30 or 40 people watching. We had a Q&A afterwards, and it was really a discussion. Like I pretty much backed out. You know, I think that's what's interesting is with those kinds of discussions, I contribute very little. You know, usually it's a panel, and there's like a policy person and, you know, a psychiatrist and a lawyer. You know what I mean? So really, I have very little to offer. You know, they all have much more expertise and experience than I do. And it's rare that somebody really, you know, wants to talk about the filmmaking, but I think that's great. I mean, that's what I would like to see more of. And we can do that virtually. Like it's totally doable. It's not the same, but it's, you know, it's possible.
I'm pretty light on the filmmaking stuff. I don't know what kind of interesting, especially with docs, you know, what kind of interesting stories you might have, since most of the work is you sitting alone in a room looking at video for hours.
I know we don't have any behind the scenes photos of that. No, that's what it was. I have some binders I could pull off a shelf if you want to see them. Big binders full of transcripts.
What are you working on next?
Right now I'm in the middle of a project on gun violence in St. Louis, and it started off in December last year as something about gun violence and the rollout of Cure Violence in St. Louis and some other initiatives to sort of look at violence as a public health issue. And then very quickly it evolved into a film about the gun violence epidemic in the shadow of a larger global pandemic, and some of the sort of the parallels between those and some of the really stark differences between the ways that they're being treated.
It's gun violence is drastically down this year, is it not?
It is drastically up in St. Louis. So yeah, we are, and it's not like, I think nationwide, I want to say domestic violence, and you know, including incidents with guns are up this year. But in St. Louis, it's really interesting because if you look at the COVID-19 death rate, and if you look at the gun death rate in the city of St. Louis, guns got a good head start. You know, they were strong at the beginning, but then they kind of dropped down, and COVID-19 caught up, and then guns surpassed COVID-19 deaths, which is where we are right now. So we have a record number of, not a record number, but a higher number than in many previous years of gun deaths in St. Louis, and that's compared to years when our population was, you know, 1.5 times what it is now.
St. Louis is on the decline population-wise?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Well, thanks for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to talk about the film and everything behind it. And yeah, I'll look forward to checking out that. That sounds right up my alley, really.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be working on it, and also disappointed that I couldn't find a feel-good topic for this next one. I feel like I keep doing this. I always say I want to do something fun and like quirky and, you know, offbeat, and somehow I don't know how I keep on doing things like Through the Cracks. But I want to thank you for programming this film and give it another place to be seen. I was really excited about that. I really enjoyed this conversation too. So I appreciate that very much as well.
My pleasure. Yeah, cool. Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We'll be back in an hour with our next Q&A. Thank you.